Life often surprises you with unexpected events. At 74, I believed I'd seen everything: love, loss, joy, and grief. I thought I was comfortably ensconced within the peaceful, uneventful pace of old age. My days were spent in the seclusion of my rural house, surrounded by paintings, the gentle hum of my record player, and the distant sound of birdsong. I'd convinced myself that I was content and didn't need anything else from life. But then Matthew arrived. Matthew is my nephew, my younger sister's son, and he came to live with me when his life broke apart in ways that were all too familiar: a failing marriage, a career at a halt. He appeared at my door with nothing but a duffel bag, a tired grin, and a disappointed expression in his eyes. I greeted him without hesitation. I had the room, after all, and there wasn't much else going on. At first, his presence provided comfort. He breathed life into my peaceful home, a life I hadn't known I was missing. We ate together, had long chats, and shared true connections. He reminded me of a version of myself that I thought I'd lost long ago: bright, curious, and eternally hopeful. Then, something changed. It started simply: a lingering gaze, a touch that lingered only a second too long. At first, I persuaded myself I was imagining things. He was, after all, my nephew, young enough to be my son, struggling and vulnerable, relying on me for advice. There was no reason to believe there was more to it than that. But late one night, as I sat alone in my studio with a glass of wine, I heard footsteps outside the door. "Olivia?" His voice was faint and hesitant, as if he didn't know if he should be there. "Come in," I said, laying down my drink and turning to face him. He walked inside, his face lit by the warm glow of the desk lamp. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't quite identify, something that sent shivers down my spine and made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Can we speak?" he inquired, his tone just above a whisper. And with that, the trajectory of my life changed. This is a narrative about choices, the boundaries we set for ourselves, and what happens when we cross them. It's about loneliness, longing, and how quickly our lives can spin out of control when we let our guard down. If you're willing to listen, I will tell you everything, the truth of what happened that night and the nights after. I'll tell you how it all started, and how everything fell apart. I never anticipated living alone. Daniel, my spouse of over 40 years, was meant to grow old with me in this house. It was our dream, a simple but attractive cottage in the countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and lush gardens. When he died 10 years ago, everything changed. I retreated inside myself. Painting provided relief, as did routines, the expected comfort of sameness. Every day was the same: coffee in the morning, a walk in the garden, and an hour spent in my studio. My work kept me grounded: landscapes, still lives, and portraits painted with the meticulous precision of someone attempting to make sense of a world that no longer made sense to them. Friends, including my sister Karen, would visit occasionally. She'd sit at my kitchen table, sipping tea, and tell me about her son, Matthew. "Matthew is clever," she'd say, her eyes bright with pride. "But he's lost Olivia. He simply hasn't found out where he fits yet." Matthew was a distant presence in my life, someone I encountered at family events or learned about through Karen's stories. As a child, he was inquisitive and interested, often asking questions and penning stories in an old notebook. As an adult, he became a successful author, having published 3 books by the age of 30. However, his personal life was less solid. Karen contacted me one day, her voice strained with concern. "Matthew isn't doing well," she said. "His marriage has ended, and he's struggling to compose. He wants a change of environment, somewhere peaceful to clear his mind." "I was hoping he could stay with you for a while." I paused. It wasn't that I didn't want to help. It was simply that I wasn't sure how to share my space with someone after so many years alone. But Karen sounded desperate, and I couldn't bring myself to say no. Of course, I told her. "He's welcome here." When Matthew arrived, I saw how much he had changed. The confident, outgoing young man I recalled was gone, replaced by someone quieter and more introspective. He appeared exhausted, his shoulders stooped, and his eyes darkened with tiredness. He brought only one duffel bag, leaving the rest of his belongings behind in the city. "Hello, Aunt Olivia," he said, attempting a grin. "Matthew," I answered, pulling him into a hug. "It's nice to see you." His room was ready, a pleasant retreat overlooking the garden. I had filled it with fresh flowers and a stack of books I thought he might like. He appeared truly moved by the gesture, thanking me with sincerity that made me feel both grateful and sorry for him. At first, we kept our distance. He spent most of his time in his room, working on his laptop or looking out the window. I gave him space, uncertain how to approach him given his evident state of despair. However, as the days turned into weeks, we began to establish a routine. I cooked. He joined me in the kitchen for supper, offering to help by cutting vegetables or setting the table. We'd sit together and dine in companionable silence, discussing inconsequential topics like the weather or the books he was reading. Slowly, he began to open up. "I feel like I've lost everything," he said one night, his voice filled with anguish. "My marriage, my career, it's all gone." I reached across the table to lay my hand on his. "You haven't lost everything, Matthew. You're here, you have a loving family, and you're still young enough to rebuild." He offered me a faint, grateful smile. "Thanks, Aunt Olivia. I'm not sure what I'd do without you." "Matthew," I said, attempting a grin, but the moment lingered, weighted by an undercurrent I couldn't quite name. We moved, talked, and appeared to fill the space as always. The friendship we'd formed was still present, but there was an undertone of strain. I became more conscious of him, the way he moved, the way he spoke, and the way he seemed to occupy the entire space. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking things. But late at night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about him and how he made me feel. One evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, he stopped me in the kitchen. "Can we speak?" he inquired, his voice hesitant. "Of course," I said, turning to face him. He seemed to struggle for words. For a brief moment, he looked as if he might retreat. Then he spoke. "I just wanted you to know how much you mean to me," he explained. "You've been so sweet and patient. I'm not sure what I would do without you." His remarks were full of emotion, and I felt a knot form in my throat. "You don't need to thank me, Matthew." "I'm pleased to have you here," I replied. But the way he looked at me, intently, seeking, indicated he had more to say. "Matthew," I began, my voice faltering. Before I could continue, he moved closer, his fingers brushing against mine. The air between us felt thick, charged with something I didn't want to name. The line between us blurred irreversibly on a calm autumn evening. The day had passed uneventfully. Matthew and I had spent the afternoon in the garden, removing the final relics of summer. The air was crisp, full of the earthy aroma of fallen leaves, and the warm light of the setting sun cast a golden glow over everything. As we worked, Matthew seemed more at ease than I'd seen him in weeks. He laughed readily, his former gloom replaced by a captivating kindness. "You have a knack for this, Aunt Olivia," he said, pointing to the neatly trimmed hedges and freshly churned soil. "It's as if you've made your own small planet here." I grinned, wiping my hands with my gardening gloves. "This has been my haven. It has kept me grounded, particularly after." My words drifted off, but he nodded as if understanding what I hadn't said aloud. That evening, after dinner, he poured us both a glass of wine, a tradition we'd developed since his arrival. We sat in the living room, the fireplace crackling softly in the background. The house felt warm, inviting, and secure, a sharp contrast to the growing discomfort within myself. It began simply enough. We discussed literature, as we often did. He had been rereading one of his favorite books, The Great Gatsby, and we explored its themes: love, ambition, and the elusive nature of happiness. "It's quite sad," he remarked, swirling the wine in his glass. "Gatsby spent his entire life chasing an impossible dream." I agreed, reflecting on my own life and the dreams I'd let go of over the years. "Sometimes it's easier to hold on to an idea than to face reality," I said. He gazed at me intently. "Aunt Olivia," he began, his voice soft, "do you ever feel settled? Did you give up on anything you wanted?" I was surprised by the question. I took a sip of wine to buy myself time. I'm not sure, I admitted. Ultimately, I believe there were certain things I desired but didn't get, but I don't regret the life I've led. It's been meaningful. Meaningful, he repeated, his tone reflective. That's a nice word for it. He paused, his gaze distant. I believe I've been chasing the wrong things my entire life, and now that I've lost them, I'm not sure what's left. I stretched out my hand and placed it over his. You're still young, Matthew. You have time to figure things out. His hand tightened around mine, and for a moment, the air between us changed. It wasn't until later, alone in my studio, that I understood how much that moment had unsettled me. I tried to focus on the canvas in front of me, but my mind kept returning to Matthew, the way he had looked at me, the warmth of his hand on mine. I convinced myself it was nothing, a brief moment of vulnerability. There was nothing more. But then I heard footsteps outside the door. Olivia? His voice was low and hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he should be there. Come in, I replied, putting down my brush and turning to face him. He stepped inside, his face lit by the soft glow of the desk lamp. Something in his eyes caused my heart to accelerate. Is everything okay? I asked, attempting to sound nonchalant. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know, he said. I just needed to talk to you. Of course, I said, gesturing for him to sit. He didn't sit. Instead, he stepped forward, his hands fumbling anxiously at his sides. When he spoke, it was in a barely audible whisper. I feel lost. My life feels like chaos, and you're the only thing that makes sense. His words sent a shockwave through me. I opened my mouth to reply, but before I could, he closed the distance between us. Aunt Olivia, his voice cracked. For a moment, he appeared so vulnerable, so lost, that I couldn't bring myself to stop him as he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, delicate, tentative, as if he expected me to pull away. But I didn't. The kiss was brief, yet it felt as though time had frozen. When he pulled back, his eyes were filled with dread and longing. I'm sorry, he said hastily. I shouldn't have. Matthew, I interrupted, my voice shaking. You're going through so much right now. I understand. Even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. What had just happened was not right. I didn't understand it, nor the emotions it had stirred within me. Matthew's absence clung to me like a smothering cloak. No matter how shattered or desperate we both felt, what had transpired between us was a mistake. For several days, we avoided one another. Matthew remained in his room, only leaving to grab a cup of coffee or a dish of food. I occupied myself with painting, but the strokes on the canvas were aimless and disorganized. I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts kept returning to him, to that moment, and to the unsaid tension that now hovered between us like a dense cloud. On the third day, he finally broke his silence. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of tea going cold in my hands, when he entered. He looked uncomfortable, his customary confidence replaced with something cautious and uncertain. Good morning, he said quietly. Good morning, I replied, attempting to appear casual, but my voice quivered slightly, betraying the conflict beneath the surface. He sat across from me, his hands clasped on the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The stillness between us was nearly painful. Eventually, he cleared his throat. Aunt Olivia. I stopped him, raising my hand. Matthew, we don't need to discuss it. It was a mistake, a moment of misunderstanding. He trembled as I spoke, his jaw tightening. Is that all it was to you? A mistake? I gazed at him, surprised by the hurt in his words. What else could it be? I'm not sure, he admitted, his gaze dropping to the table. But that didn't feel like a mistake to me. It felt real. His remarks jolted me, but I pushed myself to remain calm. Matthew, you're having a terrible time right now. You're fragile. And I should have been more careful. Careful? He repeated, his voice rising slightly. You think this is only about vulnerability? What about me being lost? Isn't it? I inquired, my tone sharper than I intended. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You don't understand, do you? He exclaimed, his eyes blazing. You think I don't know how I'm feeling, that I'm just a damaged kid clinging to the first person who's been kind to me. But this isn't about that, Olivia. It's about you. Me? I echoed, shocked. Yes, you, he said, his voice softening slightly. You're wonderful, and you don't even realize it. You've made a beautiful life for yourself. You've been kind and sympathetic to me. You make me feel alive. His words left me breathless, but filled with fear. This wasn't something we could explore. It simply couldn't be. Matthew, I care about you, I said cautiously. But this cannot happen. It's not right. He gazed at me for a long time, and I could sense the agony in his eyes. I understand, he said eventually. I'll pack my things and leave. Matthew, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he stated firmly. Staying here will only make things worse for both of us. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to stop him, to tell him to stay so we could work things out together. But another part of me knew he was right. The next morning, he was gone.